The year was 1000 AD. Across Europe, the dawn broke not with the roar of engines or the hum of cities, but with the cries of roosters, the clanging of church bells, and the creak of wooden wheels over mud roads. Europe was not one great empire. It was a patchwork of tiny kingdoms, duchies, and villages, each ruled by a lord or king, and all bound together by two forces, faith and fear. The people of this age called themselves Christians, but they were haunted by superstition. Many believed the world might end that very year. The turning of the millennium filled hearts with dread. Priests warned that the apocalypse might come at any moment, but the sun still rose. Life continued, and Europe entered a new chapter. Imagine standing on a cold hillside in France or England around 1000 AD. Below you stretch farmlands, patches of green and brown, where peasants bend their backs beneath gray skies. They are the heart of the feudal system, a brutal order that shaped medieval life. At the top sat the king, owner of vast lands but dependent on his lords and barons for loyalty. These lords were given land, called fiefs, in exchange for military service. Beneath them were the knights, armored warriors sworn to protect their lord's honor. And at the bottom, peasants, the serfs, worked the soil, not for themselves, but for their masters. A serf's life was not his own. He could not leave the land, could not marry without permission, and paid taxes in grain and sweat. He lived in a hut of wood and straw, his children often barefoot, his wife tending goats or weaving wool. Still, life went on. Peasants sang at harvest, feasted at saints' days, and prayed for rain. Their faith was simple and strong because in a world of hunger and war, heaven was their only hope. Above kings and knights another power ruled, the church. In Rome sat the Pope, spiritual leader of Christendom. Every village had a church, every region had monasteries, where monks wrote, prayed, and preserved knowledge. In a Europe without schools, the church was the only light of learning. The Catholic Church owned nearly 1/3 of all land in Europe. Priests could bless or curse kings. Bishops acted as advisors to rulers, and monasteries were centers of both prayer and politics. People believed the church held the keys to heaven and hell. If you angered the church, you risked excommunication, being cut off from salvation. Even mighty kings trembled before that power. The morning begins with fog over a small English village. Peasants rise before dawn. Women fetch water from the well. Men gather sickles and head to the fields. In the distance, a church bell tolls, echoing through the valley. Inside the church, candles flicker. A priest in coarse robes murmurs Latin prayers. The peasants kneel on cold stone, crossing themselves, asking for mercy from a god they barely understand. Outside, the blacksmith hammers iron for a knight's sword. Children chase chickens. The lord of the manor rides past on horseback, armored in chainmail, his crest shining in the pale light. Peasants bow as he passes. He nods, but does not stop. For him, these people are not citizens. They are his property. In castles of gray stone, lords and knights prepared for war almost constantly. Europe was a land of conflict and ambition. A border dispute, a family insult, or a challenge of honor could ignite battles that lasted years. Knights were the elite warriors of their time, trained from boyhood, bound by the code of chivalry, and sworn to defend the faith. They wore steel armor, rode war horses, and fought with swords, lances, and courage. Yet, beneath the glory was blood and brutality. Villages burned, women were taken, and fields were destroyed. There were no rules of modern war, just survival and pride. The castle, with its tall walls and deep moats, became the symbol of the age. It was both fortress and home, a monument to power in a world of chaos. Despite the wars and famines, there was still beauty. In monasteries across Europe, from Ireland to Italy, monks copied ancient texts by candlelight. They preserved the writings of Rome, Greece, and the Bible. Their hands shaped the memory of civilization itself. In cities like Venice, Florence, and Paris, trade began to grow again. Merchants traveled with caravans, bringing silk from the east, spices from Arabia, and gold from Africa. The seeds of future prosperity were being planted quietly in the soil of the Dark Ages. For centuries, Viking raiders from Scandinavia had terrorized Europe. They burned monasteries, stole treasures, and enslaved people. But around the year 1000, a change came. The Vikings began to settle. Kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway accepted Christianity. The once feared Norsemen became rulers, traders, and converts. The age of raids gave way to the age of kingdoms. Europe was slowly forming into the nations we know today. In France, the Capetian dynasty began to consolidate power under King Hugh Capet. In England, the Anglo-Saxon kings ruled, unaware that soon the Normans would invade and change history forever. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire rose under Emperor Otto III, dreaming of reviving the glory of ancient Rome. Borders shifted constantly, but the dream of unity under faith and law began to take root. For the common people, the year 1000 brought little change. They still worked the same fields, feared the same diseases, and prayed to the same God. But deep beneath the surface, Europe was awakening. The fear of the world's end had passed, and a new sense of destiny was rising. Kings dreamed of power, the church dreamed of empire, and people dreamed of peace. What no one knew was that this new millennium would bring centuries of crusades, plagues, revolts, and rebirth. The dark dawn had passed. The age of faith and fire was about to begin.
The year was 1066. Europe was still wild. Its forests thick, its cities small, its kingdoms restless. But in the north, a storm was gathering across the English Channel. A man named William, Duke of Normandy, prepared to invade England. He was not just a warrior, he was a visionary. He believed that God himself had chosen him to be the rightful king of England. And so began one of the most decisive moments in medieval Europe, the Norman Conquest. October 14, 1066, the fields of Hastings ran red with blood. Two armies faced each other, the Anglo-Saxons led by King Harold Godwinson, and the Normans, led by William the Conqueror. The Saxons fought on foot, shoulder to shoulder, behind wooden shields. The Normans came on horseback, knights in chainmail, banners flying, the ground shaking beneath the charge. For hours, the battle raged, arrows darkened the sky. Horses fell screaming, and then, a single arrow struck King Harold in the eye. The English line broke. By sunset, William stood victorious, the new King of England. With that victory, Europe changed forever. Norman castles, language, and culture spread across the land. Feudalism tightened its grip. England had entered the true age of kings. After the conquest, stone castles began to rise, massive fortresses of power. Every hill had a keep, every river a tower. They were symbols of strength and of fear. Inside these walls lived the lords and their families. They dined on roasted meat and drank wine while peasants outside starved in the cold. But life for knights was not all luxury. They were bound by the code of chivalry, honor, bravery, and loyalty to God and their lord. By day, they trained with swords and lances. By night, they prayed before the cross, swearing to defend the weak and serve justice, though war often turned that promise to ashes. The Norman system spread across Europe. France, Germany, and Italy adopted the pyramid of power: kings, lords, knights, peasants. But behind the structure lay endless politics. Lords plotted against each other. Brothers betrayed brothers for land. Kings fought to keep their crowns, and the church watched, waiting to bless or curse whichever side suited them. It was a time when faith mixed with ambition, and Europe became a chessboard of power. Knighthood was both glory and death. Tournaments were held to prove strength. Lances shattered, armor clanged, and banners waved. But the same knights who jousted for sport were also killers on the battlefield. When war came, chivalry died quickly. Villages burned, peasants fled, knights fought not for justice but for gold and pride. Yet, in songs and stories, poets painted them as heroes, noble, flawless, holy warriors. In truth, they were men shaped by violence, chained to the will of kings. Beneath all this, the peasants still suffered. They farmed, prayed, and hoped for mercy. A single bad harvest could mean famine. Disease spread easily, medicine barely existed. Children died young, and winters were cruel. But their faith kept them alive. They believed that obedience on earth would earn them paradise in heaven, and in that belief, they found peace no king could take away. By the late 11th century, kingship became divine. Kings claimed they ruled by the will of God. Their coronations took place in cathedrals, with holy oil and golden crowns. William's descendants built cathedrals across England and Normandy, each stone whispering of power and faith. Europe was now truly a world of crowns and crosses, where kings ruled in God's name, and knights bled for glory. But beyond the horizon, a new fire was rising. A call to holy war that would shake every throne on the continent.
It was the year 1095. Europe had changed. Kingdoms grew stronger, castles rose taller, but the church had become the true empire. From Rome, Pope Urban VI looked eastward, far across the Mediterranean. The holy city of Jerusalem had fallen under Muslim rule. Pilgrims from Europe were attacked, robbed, sometimes killed on their way to the sacred city. And so, one cold November day, in the town of Clermont, France, the Pope raised his voice to the heavens. Thousands gathered in a muddy field outside the city walls. Priests, knights, peasants, all silent as the Pope climbed the wooden platform. He lifted his hands and cried,
"Brothers of Christ, our holy land is in the hands of the infidels. Christ commands you to go and free it."
The crowd erupted. Swords were raised, crosses lifted, men wept.
Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it!
It was the beginning of the First Crusade. A war that would last 2 centuries, fought in the name of faith, but driven by ambition, greed, and blood. Before the kings and knights could even organize their armies, ordinary people began marching. Farmers, women, children, led by preachers who claimed to speak for God. They had no armor, no training, no plan, just faith. They believed that walking to Jerusalem would cleanse their sins, but faith alone could not feed them. Many starved or were killed long before reaching the Holy Land. Some turned violent, attacking Jewish communities in Europe, a dark shadow on a holy mission. This first wave, the People's Crusade, ended in tragedy, but the real armies were still coming. By 1097, Europe's greatest lords had gathered their knights: Godfrey of Bouillon, noble of France, Raymond of Toulouse, the wise and old Bohemond of Taranto, the fierce Norman. Together, they marched across the Byzantine Empire toward the deserts of Syria and Palestine. Tens of thousands followed them, crusaders bearing crosses stitched on their tunics. The journey was hell. Men died of thirst, horses collapsed in the sand, but they kept walking, driven by the promise of heaven and glory. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Alexios Komnenos, watched them uneasily. He had asked for help, but now thousands of armed fanatics were crossing his lands. He helped them anyway, for he too wanted the Turks defeated. In 1099, after years of hunger, betrayal, and siege, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem. The holy city stood before them, shining under the desert sun, surrounded by strong walls. For 40 days they fought outside the gates. Then, one morning in July, they broke through. What followed was not divine. It was chaos. The Crusaders massacred thousands. Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians. None were spared. The streets ran red with blood, and in the heart of the city, the victors knelt at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping in triumph and horror. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was born, and Europe rejoiced, believing that God's will had been done. But victory carried a curse. The Crusaders built castles and claimed land. But they were now strangers in a foreign desert, surrounded by powerful Muslim empires. Back in Europe, new crusades were declared. The Second Crusade, Third Crusade, and beyond, each bloodier, each more desperate. Heroes rose, like Richard the Lionheart of England and Saladin, the noble Muslim leader. Their battles became legends of courage, mercy, and endless war. Yet for every hero, thousands of peasants died nameless under the sun. By 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land fell. The Crusades were over. Europe had gained no paradise, only pain. But the Crusades changed everything. Trade routes opened between East and West. New ideas, spices, and knowledge flowed into Europe, and the Church's power reached heights it had never known before. Still, behind every victory song, there were echoes of screams. The same cross that blessed soldiers also marked graves. Faith had built empires, but fire had consumed them. As the 14th century approached, Europe stood proud yet broken. Rich in faith, poor in soul, and far on the horizon, a darker storm was already rising. A plague, a death that would silence millions. As the 12th century faded into the 13th, the idea of a single ruler, a true emperor, returned to Europe. In the heart of the continent stood the Holy Roman Empire, a vast and tangled realm stretching from Germany to northern Italy. Its ruler, the emperor, was seen as the heir to ancient Rome, God's chosen king on earth. But the empire was not one united nation. It was a puzzle of hundreds of duchies, kingdoms, and free cities, each with its own pride, army, and laws. Among these emperors, none shone brighter than Frederick II, a man of learning and war, called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He spoke 6 languages, studied science, and questioned the church. He dreamed of an empire ruled by logic, not superstition. But in doing so, he earned a dangerous enemy, the Pope himself. While kings fought for land, the popes of Rome fought for souls and control. The church had grown unimaginably rich. Monasteries owned vineyards, cathedrals rose like mountains, and the Pope crowned, or cursed, kings at will. In the 1200s, Pope Innocent III declared himself the supreme authority over all Christian rulers. He claimed the power to judge emperors, depose kings, and command crusades not only in the Holy Land, but within Europe itself. When kings disobeyed, the Pope could strike back with interdict, shutting down churches, weddings and burials across entire kingdoms. To the medieval mind, this meant no salvation, no heaven. The people would turn against their own rulers in terror. The Pope's word had become stronger than any sword, but not every king bowed. In England, King John defied the church, taxing his nobles and ignoring the Pope's orders. For years he fought against his own barons, his own people, until rebellion forced him to his knees. It was the year 1215, and on a meadow called Runnymede, the barons demanded that the king sign a document, a parchment that would change history forever. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was born. It declared that even the king must obey the law. No man could be imprisoned without cause. Taxes required consent, and justice could not be sold. For the first time, the idea of rights and limits to royal power was written down. John signed it unwillingly, his seal pressed into wax, his pride broken. He never meant to keep his promise, but the idea had escaped into the world, and once born, ideas never die. Across Europe, whispers of rebellion spread. Peasants still toiled in misery, but their anger simmered. Towns grew larger. Places like Paris, London, and Florence swelled with merchants and craftsmen. The middle class was being born. Not knights, not peasants, but traders, scholars, bankers. They wanted freedom to work, to earn, to think. Meanwhile, the church fought heresy with fire. Those who questioned its teachings were branded as heretics, hunted by the Inquisition, tortured, and burned at the stake. Faith had turned to fear, and fear kept Europe silent. Yet even in the shadows, light returned. Trade routes reconnected east and west. Silk, spices, and ideas flowed through the ports of Venice and Genoa. Wealth turned towns into cities, cities into powers. Universities appeared, in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, where young minds studied philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. Latin was still the language of learning, but curiosity was breaking old walls. Europe was slowly awakening again, and in the streets, new voices sang, not of war or saints, but of love. Poets like Dante Alighieri began to write in the language of the people. His Divine Comedy imagined heaven and hell with human passion, not just divine law. It was a new way of thinking, one that would one day ignite the Renaissance. By the early 1300s, Europe seemed strong again. Kings ruled powerful nations. The church sat in gold. The people dreamed of better lives. But beneath the illusion of order, death was coming. In the east, along the Silk Road, an invisible enemy was spreading. Selma Schooner ben Bar. Can Cairo Briganer Tunapar Arab. Bar about rats and ships. No sword could stop it, no prayer could cure it. And when it reached Europe's shores, it would erase a third of the population in a single generation. The Black Death was coming. And with it, the world would change forever. It began quietly. In the autumn of 1347, 12 ships from the east arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. They came from the Black Sea, heavy with trade goods, and something unseen. When the people went to greet the sailors, they found them dead. Their skin was darkened with strange black swellings, buboes, the sign of the Black Death. The few still alive were delirious, bleeding from their mouths and ears. Within days, the disease spread through the city like fire in dry grass. No one understood it. No one could stop it. By the time the ships were burned, the plague had already escaped. From Sicily, it moved north, through Italy, France, Spain, and England, carried by rats, by merchants, by the wind itself. Everywhere it went, death followed. Doctors wore long robes and bird-shaped masks filled with herbs to block the bad air, but they were powerless. The sick died within days, coughing blood, feverish, terrified. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Whole towns vanished in weeks. Chronicles say, the living were not enough to bury the dead. Church bells rang endlessly until no one was left to ring them. Europe's great cities, Paris, Florence, London, fell silent, markets closed, fields went untended, kings fled their palaces, nobles hid in the countryside, priests refused to visit the dying. In Florence, poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote, "Brothers abandoned brothers, wives abandoned husbands, parents abandoned children." The social order of centuries shattered. No lord, no pope, no army could command death. It was as if God himself had turned away. As the world crumbled, faith twisted into madness. Some believed the plague was God's punishment for sin. They formed groups called flagellants, men who marched through towns whipping themselves, begging for mercy. Others blamed outsiders, especially the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells. Thousands of innocent people were massacred in fear and superstition. The church, overwhelmed, could not control the chaos. Priests died faster than they could be replaced. And still, the bells kept ringing. By 1350, nearly 1/3 of Europe, about 25 million souls, were gone. Art and literature changed forever. Everywhere, painters drew skeletons dancing with kings, bishops, and peasants, the danse macabre, or dance of death. It was a reminder that death spares no one. In churches, sermons no longer promised wealth or power, only salvation. The people began to question everything they had been taught. If God allowed this, what did that mean? A silent revolution was beginning, in thought, in faith, in humanity, and yet, even after all that death, life returned. By the 1350s, survivors began to rebuild. With so many dead, labor became precious. Peasants demanded better pay, better lives. Old hierarchies crumbled. A strange, new energy spread. Curiosity, art, invention. Those who had faced death now hungered for life. They painted, built, and dreamed again. Europe was rising, scarred but reborn. The darkness had ended, and a new light was coming. A light called the Renaissance. Europe stood in ruins, but alive. Fields once empty now grew green again. Villages rebuilt, bells rang once more, and the air felt lighter. The survivors of the Black Death were changed. They had faced death itself, and in that darkness, they had found courage. They no longer lived for the church alone or for kings. They began to live for themselves, for life, for creation. This was the dawn of a new age, an age men would later call the Renaissance, from the Italian word rinascimento, meaning rebirth. It began in Italy, in cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan, where trade brought not just goods, but ideas. Wealthy merchant families like the Medici of Florence became patrons of art and science. They believed that human creativity was a reflection of God's perfection. The walls that once held people in fear began to crumble. Artists painted not saints, but humans, their beauty, emotion, and struggle. Philosophers rediscovered the writings of ancient Greece and Rome. The human mind became the new cathedral. Among the masters, one name rose like the sun: Leonardo da Vinci, painter, inventor, scientist, dreamer. He painted the Mona Lisa, whose smile hides centuries of mystery. He designed flying machines centuries before planes were real, and studied anatomy to understand how life itself moved. Then came Michelangelo, who carved stone until it breathed. His David stood as a symbol of human strength, not divine power, but mortal courage. In the Sistine Chapel he painted creation itself upon the ceiling, and when he finished, the world had changed forever. Art was no longer just decoration. It was a mirror to the soul. But the Renaissance was not only about beauty, it was about knowledge. In the mid-1400s, a man named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. For the first time in history, books could be copied quickly and cheaply. Ideas spread like wildfire. Poems, philosophies, maps, and dreams crossed borders faster than any army could march. Education was no longer just for monks and nobles. It was for everyone who could read. The written word became the most powerful weapon in the world. Curiosity turned outward. Men began to look beyond the horizon. Sailors studied the stars, drew maps, and built ships strong enough to cross oceans. In 1492, an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, set out west, and found a world no European had ever seen before. The discovery of the Americas would change everything: trade, power, and even destiny itself. Explorers followed. Vasco da Gama reached India. Magellan circled the globe. Europe, once trapped by fear and plague, now stretched its hands across the earth. By 1500, the light of the Renaissance burned brightly across Europe. Art, science, and faith began to walk side by side. The stars were no longer symbols, they were questions to be answered. and man, once broken by the plague, had rediscovered his strength. The old world had died in darkness, the new one was born in light. The Renaissance had not only rebuilt Europe, it had redefined what it meant to be human. The age of discovery had begun, and soon, the world itself would awaken. The Renaissance had awakened Europe's hunger for discovery. Men no longer looked only at heaven, they looked toward the horizon. Whispers spread of gold across the seas, of unknown lands beyond maps. The old world felt small, and the new world called. At the edges of the known world stood sailors, dreamers, and kings, each driven by faith, fortune, and fame. And so began the Age of Exploration. In 1492, an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the flag of Spain, set out across the Atlantic Ocean, convinced he could reach Asia by going west. For months his men stared at endless blue water, terrified they would fall off the edge of the world. Then one morning they saw birds and green leaves floating on the waves, and at dawn, land. They had reached the Americas, a continent unknown to Europe. Columbus believed he had found India. He had instead found a new world, one that would change all worlds forever. Soon, others followed. Amerigo Vespucci, whose name would give the continents their title, America. Ferdinand Magellan, who sailed around the entire earth, proving it was round. Vasco da Gama, who reached India by sea and opened the route of spices and silk. Each voyage brought back treasures, gold, silver, gems, and stories of lands filled with strange people, animals, and gods. But along with explorers came something darker: conquest. The kings of Europe, especially Spain and Portugal, became richer than ever before. From their ports sailed fleets of ships, carrying guns, crosses, and flags. They claimed vast territories: South America, the Caribbean, Africa, India. Spain's empire stretched from the Andes to the Philippines. Portugal ruled the trade routes of Africa and Asia. Gold and silver flowed into Europe, and for the first time, the world became connected. But this new power came at a cost. As Europe's empires expanded, millions suffered. The arrival of the Europeans brought disease, war, and slavery to the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Africa. Entire civilizations, the Aztecs and Incas, fell before Spanish steel and fire. Missions converted, soldiers conquered, and the church followed, blessing the empire in God's name. It was an age of glory and greed, of faith and blood. In Europe, kings built palaces of gold while peasants starved. Power grew, but so did corruption. And soon, the people would begin to question the very soul of their world. By the end of the 16th century, Europe had transformed itself. It was no longer a cluster of medieval kingdoms, it was the center of a global empire. Ships sailed from Lisbon, Seville, London, and Amsterdam to every corner of the earth. Maps filled with new names: America, Africa, Asia, Oceania. Trade carried not only goods, but ideas. Science, faith, art, and war. The world had become one vast ocean of opportunity and danger, and as the sun rose on a new century, another revolution was about to begin, not of swords, but of beliefs. For more than 1,000 years, the church ruled over Europe's soul. Kings bowed to priests, and knowledge bowed to faith. But by the 1500s, whispers had begun, that the church had lost its way, drowning in power and gold. Books were rare, written only in Latin. Benang died. Saul. Ingstur craw, wat lang, ardiagen by, avregai, formadin dinser, ho, aldvia. Fondin dan de few. But a new invention had changed everything: the printing press. Now words could travel faster than armies, and one man's words would shake the world. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. He accused the church of selling forgiveness, trading heaven for gold. His message spread like wildfire through printed pages. People who had never dared to question faith now asked, do we need priests to reach God? Or is God within us? The church declared him a heretic. But it was too late. Europe had awakened. The Protestant Reformation had begun. From England to France, from Germany to Sweden. Christendom was torn in half. Wars erupted everywhere: Catholics versus Protestants, brother versus brother, father versus son. The 30 Years' War turned towns into ash, and millions died in the name of heaven. Yet, beneath the smoke, something was changing. People began to question not only religion, but authority itself. They started to believe, if kings and priests can be wrong about God, they can be wrong about everything. In secret chambers, scholars began to study the universe. One of them was Galileo Galilei. He built a telescope and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proof that Earth was not the center of creation. The church called it blasphemy. Galileo whispered to himself, and yet, it moves. Then came Isaac Newton, revealing the laws of gravity, and Descartes, who said, I think, therefore, I am. Knowledge had broken its chains. Science had become the new religion of truth. With the new ideas came new courage. Books spread like light, teaching freedom, equality, and reason. Men like John Locke began to write of human rights, of a world where kings ruled by consent, not by birth. Artists painted not saints, but the human soul. Philosophers argued that power belonged not to the crown, but to the people. It was the dawn of the Enlightenment. By the end of the 17th century, the old order trembled. Kings still ruled, but their crowns were cracking. The church still prayed, but fewer listened. And across the Atlantic, in the colonies of the New World, a new idea began to rise. Freedom. A whisper that would soon become a revolutionary roar. The 18th century began with the flame of reason. In coffee houses and candlelit rooms, thinkers gathered. Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Locke, men who questioned everything. They spoke not of kings and crowns, but of rights and freedom, of justice and reason. They believed that every human being was born with the same worth, and that no man had the divine right to rule another. It was a time when books became weapons, words became armies, and ideas became revolutions. Across the Atlantic, the American colonies lived under British rule. Taxes grew heavy, and freedom shrank small. Then, in 1776, a young man named Thomas Jefferson wrote words that would echo through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The American Revolution began. Farmers turned into soldiers. They fought not for land, but for liberty. George Washington led an army that had little food, little training, but a fire that no empire could kill. After years of blood and struggle, the impossible happened. America was free. The world watched and learned. If a people could rise against an empire, then perhaps anyone could. But Europe was still trapped in its old chains. In France, kings feasted while peasants starved. The poor paid taxes, the rich paid none. Then, in 1789, the storm broke. Crowds gathered in Paris shouting, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. They stormed the Bastille, and with that, a kingdom of 1,000 years began to crumble. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette tried to flee, but the people had no mercy left. The guillotine fell, and with it they tried to draw Baudit and Oberbrow, would fan draw with qualm and jure Bauden an Aubé. In Pondri don in Trau de draw Praki Dragi Drawdis Reich, where blood ran in the streets and freedom was born in fire. All across Europe, kings trembled. They called France mad, but deep down, they feared their own people might rise next. The reign of terror consumed France as revolutionaries turned on each other. Liberty had come, but peace had not. And in that chaos, a new leader began to rise from the ashes, a man who would soon crown himself emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte, a soldier from Corsica, watched the revolution burn and saw opportunity in its ruins. He rose from general to hero, from hero to conqueror. He reformed France, gave people new rights, and built an army that swept across Europe. He defeated kings, broke empires, and crowned himself Emperor of France. But his dream of endless glory would soon cost him everything. As his cannons thundered across the continent, Europe entered a new age of power and ambition. By the end of the 18th century, Europe was no longer the same continent. Faith had given way to reason, kingdoms had fallen to revolutions, and the world had learned a dangerous truth. If one man can rise, so can an entire nation. The age of revolution had ended, but its fire burned on, in hearts, in books, and in the birth of the modern world. Europe stood scarred but alive. Napoleon's wars had burned half the continent, and now, kings gathered again to divide his fallen empire. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe. Old monarchies were restored, but the people had tasted freedom, and that taste would never fade. Beneath the peace treaties and golden halls, a new revolution was already rising. Not of swords, but of machines. It began in Britain, in smoky factories by the rivers of Manchester. Iron wheels turned, steam hissed, and the Industrial Revolution was born. Where once 100 men worked by hand, now one machine could do it in a day. Coal became the black heart of Europe. Railways cut through mountains, and steamships conquered oceans. The world became smaller, faster, louder. But with every invention came a cost. Children worked in dark factories, men died in coal mines, and cities drowned in smoke. Still, progress marched on. The rich became richer, the poor, forgotten. London, Paris, Berlin. Cities of light by night but filled with hunger by day. Writers like Charles Dickens and thinkers like Karl Marx exposed the truth that the modern world was built on broken backs. Marx wrote, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." And for the first time, workers began to rise. Unions formed, strikes spread, and a new war began. Not between nations, but between classes. As Europe's factories grew, so did its hunger for power. Nations looked beyond their borders, toward Asia, Africa, and the New World. The British Empire stretched where the sun never set. France, Germany, Belgium, all raced to claim colonies. They spoke of civilizing the world, but in truth, they conquered it for gold, cotton, and glory. Steamships carried guns and flags, and entire civilizations were rewritten. The world had become Europe's stage, and every corner echoed with its ambitions. But even as empires rose, another revolution began. One of knowledge. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, challenging the creation of man itself. Michael Faraday tamed electricity, Louis Pasteur fought disease, Alexander Graham Bell made the first phone call, and Thomas Edison's light bulb turned night into day. The 19th century was not just an age of steel, it was the age when mankind began to believe that there was nothing it could not do. As the century closed, Europe stood at its peak, industrial, imperial, and invincible. Trains roared across continents, telegraphs sent messages across oceans, and cities glittered with electric light. But deep beneath that brilliance, a new darkness was forming. Empires clashed, alliances hardened, and the machines of progress were quietly turning into machines of war. The modern world had arrived, and it carried both the promise of heaven and the shadow of hell.